Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to reintroduce you now. Tucker Goodrich is a returning guest on our show. Be sure to check out Tucker's first appearance on episode 78 and his second appearance on episode 291 of Boundless Body Radio. Tucker Goodrich is a technology executive in the financial industry who designs, runs, and debugs complex systems in high-risk environments. His areas of expertise include risk management, systems management, and cybersecurity. After experiencing some personal health crises and realizing that the solutions offered by medical professionals weren't working or addressing causation, he started applying the same approach in research and evaluation of data to his own health issues to determine root causes. His interests have focused on dietary and environmental drivers of chronic disease, including the consumption of carbohydrate, wheat, and various classes of fats, especially seed oils. Specifically, he's attempting to popularize the understanding of the mechanisms driving the diet-derived explosion in so-called chronic diseases or diseases of civilization. He is an expert advisor for the nutrition startup Zero Acre Farms and has been a guest on numerous podcasts like ours. You can find Tucker on Twitter at Tucker Goodrich. You can also find his podcast, which is on YouTube. It has the same name, Tucker Goodrich. Tucker, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
It's a pleasure to be back, Casey. Thanks for asking me.
It's my pleasure. I'm so glad we made time for this. We had a little bit of a scheduling kind of oops earlier this morning, and you were able to find my cell phone number, and you sent me a text message saying, "Hey, this is Tucker," and I had to respond like, "Is this my dog texting me back, or is this Tucker Goodrich?" I'm assuming it's Tucker. But like I said, I've told you before on the show, we have a dog named Tucker as well, and I think you've gotten your names confused before.
Yeah, I've met more dogs named Tucker in my life than really anybody should ever. Often at dog parks where I hear people calling out my name and I'm like, what?
What? Well, that's awesome. I am inviting you specifically onto the show today to talk about a topic that you have talked extensively about on other people's shows. I'm specifically referring to an appearance you did on our mutual friend, Allie Houston, and his podcast, Allie Houston Transforms podcast. What a wonderful episode that was. You talking about autoimmunity and celiac disease and wheat and all of these things that were absolutely fascinating. And you and I were kind of talking offline. It's very interesting. Oftentimes we'll put out content and not really get a ton of feedback. And you had not gotten a ton of feedback on that episode. So if nothing else, really happy just to come on and say, you did an amazing job. I will never be able to do as good a job of hosting as Ali does. He's absolutely brilliant.
Ali's great, but you do a good job too. Don't sell yourself short.
I was thinking about taking that episode and just cutting out like your parts and editing me wording Ali's questions. But I figured that would be a little disingenuous, and I figured I'd have to have you on the show to ask my own questions.
There you go. Well, I'm sure you'll be asking great questions, so no worries there.
Well, it's been longer than I thought since you've been back on the show. So as you know, we've heard your personal story. I don't think we've heard as much of it as it relates to autoimmune and your interest in autoimmune. We obviously have talked a lot about seed oils and all kinds of things related to polyunsaturated fats in our diet. I would love to hear your personal journey through autoimmunity, and then we can maybe get to what even is autoimmunity. I think the term gets thrown around a lot without people truly understanding what's actually going on.
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in a family with a history of autoimmunity, mild stuff by the scheme of things, right? I had asthma as a kid. I've had exercise and cold-induced asthma. I had eczema. My father didn't have asthma, but he had eczema so bad that it basically destroyed the fingerprints on all of his fingers. My grandfather probably had some kind of an autoimmune condition. He had problems with vertigo. I don't want to get into the whole thing because it gets kind of tedious. But as I was getting into my late 30s, I started having more and more severe autoimmune problems. I started getting all sorts of, there's a line, but there's kind of a fine line between immunity and autoimmunity. A lot of autoimmune conditions can be kicked off by an infection. So it's, for instance, type 1 diabetes often is preceded by some sort of infection. And then the body kicks into this like panic mode, I guess you could say, right? So for instance, I had a lot of sinus infections at one point, and my doctor put me on penicillin, and I had a reaction to the penicillin, hives, and so he chalked me down as being allergic to penicillin. I, at one point, had to have a imaging test prior to a surgery, and the chemical they call contrast gave me another autoimmune reaction with hives. So I was like, my daughter had autoimmune problems. My father and I both had to have shots for allergies. My daughter was on track to having shots for her allergies. And luckily for her, I was able to figure out what was causing it, right? Initially as a hypothesis, and then confirmed by her allergist, who amusingly enough had taken over the practice that I had seen when I was a kid. Um, and that resulted in her allergist firing her as a patient, saying, "You don't need to come here anymore. You're not showing any further symptoms of, allergies or autoimmune disease. So, take a Claritin if you have some symptoms, but you're not bad enough to be a patient of mine anymore." So that
Wow.
was pretty cool. And, in my fixing my diet at the same time that I was fixing her diet, because the poor thing depended on me for food, I saw all of my allergies and asthma go away and never to return. I mean, the one thing that I could never shake was a dust allergy, right? So whenever I had to clean the house, I would have this massive reaction to that. And typically I would prophylactically take some allergy medicine, Sudafed or whatever, Claritin. And it just isn't an issue. I've moved a few times. I've had to clean up. We all know that, that stirs up a lot of dust, no matter how good we are at housekeeping. And, I'll sneeze a couple times and that's it. I just don't have any reaction anymore. So it's been probably one of the most surprising and happy side effects of fixing my diet, is to see all of my allergies and my asthma and everything else is just gone. And it's
Gone.
been 13 years now, the longest period of my life I've been able to go without any sort of serious allergic problem. The penicillin allergy, to put allergy in quotes, I read a great article in the New York Times, and you can't often say it was a great article when it's in the New York Times, but it was talking about how a lot of people have what seems to be an allergic reaction to penicillin, and then on a re-challenge, nothing happens. So I went to my daughter's allergist and had him do a re-challenge with penicillin while I was sitting in his office. And, they shot me up, and I sat there for an hour and a half and nothing happened. And they wiped the diagnosis of allergic to penicillin off my chart. So that
Wow.
was a good thing. A
Wow.
good experience all around.
Yeah, that's great. And a lot of people would say that since it's been in your family for so long, this is a genetic thing. Your daughter also getting it would strongly signal that this is something that you just have to deal with. Very lucky for her, because it sounds like she was absolutely terrified of needles. Is that the case?
Oh yeah. I did I mention that in Allie's thing? Oh yeah.
You did.
I got a phone call. I was at work probably half an hour away from where she was in the process of a doctor's appointment, and she was, gosh, 4 or 5 maybe at that point, and they pulled out the needle to give her some vaccine, and she freaked out and ran out the door of the doctor's office and was running around downtown Westport screaming, "No, no, you're not going to give me a shot." So I had to leave work, drive there, catch her, and bring her back to the doctor's office to get her
That's
shot.
that's amazing.
Yeah, it was
It's
pretty
so
funny. So
savage.
yeah, she was not happy about the prospect of having to go through a multi-year course of, antigen infections to help her with her allergies. And I mean, I went through that too. And, I was still allergic to most of the stuff that I was allergic to afterward. It was better for sure, but, it's not like that's a magic bullet. Um, so yeah, that was very, very happy for her that she didn't have to go through that the way I did, and the way my father did. But yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, sure, it's clearly there's a big genetic component, but every, genes only operate in the context of an environment, right? And there's always an interplay between the environment and your genes. I know a fellow, oh gosh darn, he's the guy who founded the Ancestral Health Symposium. And I'm blanking on his name right now, but he had a severe genetic disease that basically meant he couldn't go out in the sun, right? And he, when he went on a paleo diet, he was able to resolve that to the point where the last time I saw him, when I went to the Ancestral Health Symposium in Los Angeles in 2021, I think. Yeah, 2021. He was tan and sitting outside and, no problem being in the sun anymore. And this was, a guy who had a lifelong genetic condition that he was able to completely resolve by altering his diet.
Wow.
So, yeah,
Wow.
I mean, just because, you can't always do that, but sometimes you can.
Yeah. Well, you and I talked about that last time about sun tolerance, and we see it all the time in this world when people change their diets and all of a sudden they're very much resistant to getting sunburns and can stay out in the sun much longer, have way better tolerance. So what is it? You mentioned diet. You mentioned, all of these things being, there is a genetic component, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to have to deal with these. What did you learn about our life and our lifestyles, in particular our diet, that is causing these autoimmune conditions that seem like they're just increasing all the time with everybody?
Yeah, so just to be clear, most primitive societies, and I say primitive, and people may get wigged out over that, but I say it in the most complimentary way possible because they seem to do way better with their health than we civilized people do. So clearly they're doing something right and we're doing something wrong. So kudos to them. Don't have autoimmune diseases. And I bought a book years ago called Western Diseases, Their Causes and Prevention by Burkitt and Trowell. And when they got into their autoimmune section, discussing their experience as physicians and doctors, they said that most of these autoimmune diseases are unknown in Africa in traditional societies, right? So something about the modern diet was causing people to start seeing these autoimmune conditions become more and more common. Now, probably the oldest autoimmune condition and one of the more interesting dietary transitions that we know of is celiac disease, right? Celiac has a clear genetic component. The people who are most likely to get it have a specific pattern, genetic pattern. But the genetic patterns are not sufficient. They have to also be eating wheat, right? Nobody has celiac unless they're also eating wheat, right? So it's the classic gene diet interplay, right? And evidence of people getting celiac disease from eating wheat goes back 10,000 years. They found skeletons of people who have one of the things that celiac causes to happen to your body is your bones basically rot, and they can see that in in analyses of old skeletons that they found. Celiac is basically caused by, it's one of the few autoimmune diseases where we know exactly what causes it. There's a amino acid called 33-mer, which was introduced into the wheat genome by crossing it with a plant called goat grass. The benefit of goat grass to wheat and to humans is that it is much more resistant to pests, okay? And this 33-mer amino acid is the mechanism by which goat grass is able to protect itself against pests. And unfortunately for humans, we're a pest, right? So what happens is this enzyme this amino acid causes an autoimmune reaction in the gut. It changes the constitution of proteins in the gut and makes your body think that the gut is alien. And in both insects and in humans, what happens is This causes the lining of the gut, which typically has these finger-like cilia. It causes a growth in between the cilia such that the cilia aren't exposed anymore. And that means you're unable to absorb food and can, of course, ultimately kill you, right? So we know exactly what's happening here. We know where it came from. We know when it was introduced into the human food supply, when we crossed einkorn, the original form of wheat, with goat grass. That's happened a couple of times in the course of agriculture. And we know exactly how, how this disease progresses. So is that the only situation where this happens, right? No, it's not. There's another case that we're all very familiar with. Surprisingly, 20% of the population can actually eat poison ivy and not have a reaction to it, right? Now, poison ivy, hence the name. We're all familiar with it, doesn't require any explanation. You don't add it to your salad. How does that work? Well, in poison ivy, it's not an amino acid, it's a fat. It's a fat that alters the cell membranes and causes your body to think that it is a pathogen. And the body then attacks the pathogen, right? One of the more interesting parallels between celiac disease and poison ivy is there's a manifestation of celiac disease called dermatitis herpetiformis, and it looks like a poison ivy rash on your skin, right? So something that you are eating causes a skin rash that looks like poison ivy and is a similar, it's a little bit different from poison ivy. Poison ivy is caused by contact. Obviously, we know how that works. Dermatitis herpetiformis, because it's coming from the inside out, typically happens symmetrically on the body and there's like a pattern to it. But if you have this rash, it is diagnostic of celiac disease, right? That's how good a correlation we have between that aspect of celiac disease and what causes it, which is, the genetic background and the consumption of wheat. So,
wow.
So then we'd start getting into, are there any other polyunsaturated fats in our diet that might cause this sort of reaction? Now, what's really interesting is that, lots of plants have varying degrees of saturated and unsaturated fats. The more polyunsaturated fats you find in poison ivy, the more immunogenic it is, right? The stronger it acts as an antigen. And then we start looking at vegetable oil. Seed oil is one of my favorite topics, where we also see this wide variation in the polyunsaturated fat content of different seeds. I mean, olive oil, for instance, pretty healthy food, generally regarded as such, can have a variation of from 2% to 21% polyunsaturated fat just by normal variation between different varieties of olives and different growing conditions can cause a big change in the amount of polyunsaturated fat in the olive oil. Now, how does that tie into autoimmunity? Well, when cardiologists were trying to nail down exactly what caused heart disease, they discovered their initial hypothesis was that, of course, we've all heard LDL causes heart disease. And they were trying to figure out that Brown and Goldstein, the guys who discovered the LDL receptor and got a Nobel Prize for it, after they had done that, they said, okay, well, the first step of atherosclerosis that we're aware of is white blood cells, a type known as macrophages, convert into what we call foam cells, right? And in the course of being a foam cell, they become engorged with cholesterol and fats. And their hypothesis was that they're getting all of this from consuming LDL in the body. And so they did an in vitro experiment where they combined LDL and macrophages and said, this will create foam cells. But it didn't work. Okay, that's a problem for your hypothesis. So then they realized that if you modified the LDL, that would cause the macrophages to hoover up sufficient quantities of this modified LDL to become foam cells, right? And then some other cardiologists, Steinberg and Whitstone, discovered exactly what the modification was. And it was the oxidation of the omega-6 fatty acids in the LDL, which cause it to become modified in such a way that macrophages will hoover it up and become bone cells, right? So this is boilerplate basic cardiology at this point. This is from research done in the 1970s and the 1980s. It's never been overturned. The latest European Atherosclerosis Society consensus statement on what causes cardiovascular disease blames LDL, and then references the paper from Steinberg and Whitstone titled Beyond Cholesterol, where they describe their series of research experiments showing that, omega-6 fats becoming oxidized are what is required to induce atherosclerosis, and that if you switch, from both in animals and humans, if you switch from a fatty acid rich in fat rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids, something like olive oil that's got less of it, that you make LDL resistant to becoming oxidized. That's essentially the only story that we have in cardiological science at this point, as to what causes heart disease. And there are various different pathways by which that can happen, right? I mean, oxidation of polyunsaturated fats can be triggered by smoking or by infection. So Steinberg and Whitstone went on and they kept doing research on this, and they discovered that they found an antibody that would attach to fats in the body. The cell membrane is composed of fats primarily and proteins. And what they discovered was an antibody that would bind to the cell membrane when it had become oxidized, when these polyunsaturated fats had become oxidized. And then they discovered something that's really fascinating, right? They discovered that it also binds to staph, right? The Staphylococcus aureus is one of the most common pathogens on humans. Every single one of us has it living in our skin, and it's what causes, the MRSA is a type of staph infection that, is resistant to antibiotics. It's it's one of the most common pathogens, so common that, we have a germline level antibody, meaning an antibody that's hard-coded into our genes to protect us from this pathogen. And when you get oxidized omega-6 fats in your body can't distinguish it from a pathogen infection, right?
And
So there's our link between autoimmune diseases and food. It's very simple. It alters your body in such a way that your body thinks it is itself a bacterial infection, right? And you see this in type 2 diabetes. I've found a great paper recently where they took a protein out of staph and they gave it to mice over a period of time chronically, and they discovered that it made the mice type 2 diabetic, made them insulin resistant, right? And in humans, we see that type 2 diabetes is typically preceded by oxidized LDL, up to 10 years ahead of time. In a primate model, they discovered that if they gave them an antibody to oxidized LDL, it would improve their insulin resistance. So essentially what we're looking at is common diseases like type 2 diabetes, common chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes and heart disease are essentially an autoimmune condition, which is why you see increased levels of white blood cells, macrophages attacking tissue, trying to protect the body, right? Misinterpreting oxidized omega-6 fats as a bacterial infection. And the outcome of that, like in type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance and hyperglycemia are a standard part of your body's immune repertoire, right? In sepsis, which is an extreme form of infection, your body becomes insulin resistant and hyperglycemic because those are two tools that it uses to help defend itself against infections. And we've managed to recreate that environment through common food items that you can get at your supermarket.
Wow. Wow, that's so fascinating. I do have some questions about wheat, but while we're on the topic of oxidized fats, can you tell us a little bit more about how fats oxidize and the different types of fats and I guess their ability to be oxidized?
Right. So, I'll try and keep this short just because I imagine a lot of people have heard about this. So they're effectively, from the standpoint of oxidation, there are three kinds of fats: saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated, right? And saturated fats are the ones that are most resistant to oxidation. They're the ones that are typically solid at room temperature. We have monounsaturated fats, which are essentially missing a couple of hydrogen atoms. And so a fat is a chain of carbons with hydrogen atoms attached along either side of it. If you remove a pair of hydrogens, the carbon attaches to itself again, and you get an unsaturation point. It's not saturated with hydrogen atoms. Polyunsaturated and saturated fats are missing more than one set of hydrogen atoms. So polyunsaturated, right? More than a single saturation. So the more points of unsaturation that you have, the more susceptible the fat is to oxygen coming in and attaching itself to the carbons and essentially breaking the fat apart, right? And these peroxidized fats become bioactive. They often have, they're much, surprisingly, based on how much saturated fats have been demonized over the years, a saturated fat is pretty inert. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't really react to things. It's why, for instance, you can leave a bar of soap sitting on your shelf and nothing will happen to it. Whereas, for instance, if you soak a rag in a polyunsaturated fat, it can potentially burst into flames if you put it out in the sun, which is kind of crazy to think of. But, when I was living in Idaho, my washing machine had a warning label on it saying, do not use to wash things with vegetable or cooking oils, because if they get heated up, it could cause them to burst into flames and you'll have a house fire, right?
That's insane.
On my washing machine. Now that the problem is that same process can happen in your body, right? If you have polyunsaturated fats in your cells, they are extremely susceptible to becoming oxidized. The common word for oxidation is rancidity. And when these fats become rancid, they become toxic. And, there's a variety of different things that polyunsaturated fats can become once they become oxidized. But one of the things that happens when they become oxidized is they trigger an immune response in the body, right? The body recognizes that rancid fats are dangerous and it has a process to try and remove them. Now, in the normal course of things, if you're eating a normal amount of polyunsaturated fats, that's not a problem, right? That's part of the environment that your body evolved in, and your body actually uses these polyunsaturated fats for a variety of functions, both in messaging and in immune function, and that's all good. What the problem seems to be when we stuff our bodies full of excess amounts of these polyunsaturated fats, that we get to a situation where we can't clean them out fast enough and they start building up in tissues, causing damage to proteins, and we start seeing, damage to membranes all throughout the body that the body's not able to repair, membranes and proteins that the body's not able to repair.
Wow. Okay, well, you've got me sold on all of that. It makes sense to me logically, that your body would not recognize these as, a nutrient per se. It's all the mechanisms that you're explaining as far as disease and everything we know about, macular degeneration and all that stuff with seed oils, I think is a really strong case. There's people out there who are not only making the case that like seed oils are probably not as bad as we think, but are almost making the case that they're actually like good for you, they're beneficial for you. And it's not just the the standard thing that we hear about with cholesterol. Like, yes, you can go off of butter and onto canola oil and you will drop your cholesterol, but whether or not that's a good thing doesn't really seem like it is. I sent you a podcast episode with Zach Bitter. I told you it would be a waste of your time. I don't know if you were able to listen to it or not, with a doctor who is kind of making those claims. It was very interesting. Did you end
Well,
up listening?
she's a PhD, not a medical doctor, which
Okay.
still entitles her to the title of doctor, just to be clear. Yeah, it was, Zach's a good guy. He's a friend of mine. He had her on to kind of represent the mainstream view of these things. And her name's Andrea Love. It was episode 367 of Zach's podcast. If you want to go take a look, I highly recommend it. And she's an immunologist. She was trained in microbiology, and apparently she was working for PerkinElmer, which is a company that develops scientific instruments, as well as the famous post office scales that we use to weigh our mail. And I know this because I happened to grow up in Wilton, Connecticut, which is where PerkinElmer was headquartered.
Oh, wow. Small world.
So I used to ride my bike through PerkinElmer's parking lot when I was a little kid, so I know more than I ought to about what PerkinElmer does. And then I guess now she's no longer with PerkinElmer. She's now the executive director of Lyme Disease Foundation in New Haven, Connecticut. And she goes on. What are some of the, I mean, I got about halfway through, I've done a couple of debunkings of people like this before. It's taxing to do this because she'll make a claim and I'll stop it and I'll go, look up something just to confirm that I'm not crazy, So one of the things that she says, when you look at the actual clinical evidence, there's actually no credible data that seed oils are actually implicated in any chronic disease processes. Okay, that's pretty clear. No credible data. So, is that true? At the beginning of this podcast, she comments, if you want to talk about the microbiome, I'm really interested in that. So let's go look. Quote, during the 20th century, the American diet changed dramatically and now includes a lot more vegetable oil from soybeans, the main component of which, a fat called linoleic acid, is toxic to many microbes. Among the microbes inhibited by linoleic acid is a beneficial bacterium called Lactobacillus reuteri. This microbe has become less common in Western populations, and the timing of its decline approximately follows when the consumption of soybean oil began increasing. Okay. Resilience of small intestinal beneficial bacteria to the toxicity of soybean oil fatty acids. And, we'll post a link to that in the show notes afterwards. So even in the fields she says she's interested in, there's lots of good evidence that this is a problem, right? It's well known that excess linoleic acid in the diet can induce dysbiosis, and not just in animals. She goes through, just because you have a mechanism doesn't mean that it actually applies to people. Okay, so linoleic acid, a dietary N6 polyunsaturated fatty acid, and the etiology of ulcerative colitis, a nested case control study within a European prospective cohort study. So this is a huge European-wide epidemiological project called EPIC. And what do they find? They find that there is a dose-response relationship between linoleic acid consumption and ulcerative colitis, which is an inflammatory disease in humans across all of Europe. Okay, so no credible evidence, right? She doesn't even know her own bloody field, let alone being able to state across, the whole of science, right? Even in what she claims is her area of interest. We'll quote another study here. Roles of lipid peroxidation derived electrophiles in pathogenesis of colonic inflammation and colon cancer. This is a survey paper looking at how the oxidized metabolites of linoleic acid, like what we see in ox-LDL, are implicated in various different types of inflammatory bowel diseases, because this PhD goes through how there's no good evidence for seed oils being implicated in inflammatory diseases. I mean, the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, just did a study showing that reducing seed oils in a headache population, a human RCT, made a human inflammatory disease significantly better, in fact, than we are able to accomplish with any pharmaceutical regimen for these people. So, yeah, there's a lot of credible evidence, and then now after saying that there's no credible evidence, she mentions that, oh, the American Heart Association says that linoleic acid is good for you. And then Zach brings up the Minnesota Coronary Survey. Okay. So and then she goes through that, and I won't, it's at 39:21 in the video. She knows very little about the study, but she looks it up while she's talking to Zach. She misrepresents the findings of the study, the most important of which was that it increased mortality in the group that had the higher seed oil consumption, right? This was a study that was, well, let's back up a little bit, right? Since she mentions the American Heart Association promotes the consumption of seed oils for heart disease, which she's correct about, they do, right? And when did they start doing that? In 1961, they published a paper saying that, seed oils lower cholesterol, which is true. They had never done a human RCT at that point to prove that that would be beneficial to humans. They mentioned one that was underway, which found that essentially it didn't work very well. A number of other ones came out, all of which also found that it caused more heart disease and higher rates of mortality. So the American Heart Association decided to do a national diet heart study, right? This was one of the biggest health projects at the time. It was started by the scientists who had written the 1961 American Heart Association advisory that people should consume seed oils. And it was supposed to be the definitive test of are seed oils beneficial for cardiovascular disease, right? So what happened? The National Diet Heart Study, they decided, was too big and complicated, but luckily they had done the most rigorous part of it was what became the Minnesota Coronary Survey. The fellow who designed this study was a guy we've all heard of, Ansel Keys, right? Ansel Keys was one of the principal investigators of the Minnesota Coronary Survey. So not only was this designed and run by people running the American Heart Association, it involved the National Institutes of Health. The Census Bureau was involved in helping to find people who could participate in this study. A bunch of life insurance companies who were very happy to do something that would, reduce their payouts also helped. I mean, it was a national project. It was the biggest health study ever undertaken in the world up until that point, with all the top people involved, right? So they found that They found that it did indeed lower cholesterol, but it increased mortality. And that the increase in mortality was proportional to how effectively it lowered cholesterol, right? To this day, this is the biggest, most carefully controlled study looking at the interaction of seed oil consumption and heart disease. So what does Dr. Andrea have to say about it? It's pretty painful. She misrepresents the findings. She doesn't mention that they found that it actually increased mortality, right? She doesn't mention that when they found this, that they hid the results for 16 years, right? She doesn't mention that the principal investigator, Ansel Keys, wouldn't sign the final study, right? So when it came out, it only listed Ivan France as one of the principal investigators, right? Keys dropped out.
Right.
France, when he was asked why he didn't publish it for 16 years, said the results were disappointing. Yes, because it undercut the AHA's story, right? It showed that increased consumption of seed oils increased rates of cardiovascular disease mortality. Period. End of story. And then they hid the results, right? So she says, lots of essential flaws with how they were crunching the numbers. That's baloney. They didn't see a reduction in mortality. Well, that's true. But you might want to mention that they saw an increase. And then she said they created fake food to feed these people, which is not relevant. Well, creating fake food to feed people is exactly what the dietary guidelines do.
Oh my
So of course
goodness.
it's relevant, right? I mean, the whole study was designed to justify what had already been happening since 1961, which was that we were consuming more and more seed oils, and that people were being told by their physicians that they should consume more seed oils because it was heart healthy. The American Heart Association still says that they're heart healthy, even though their own study showed that it's not. So, yeah. Okay. So much for no credible data. I mean, there's not been a single, despite what she says, which is that more recent studies have shown that it's not harmful, right? She kind of finally mentions harmful, right? Without ever saying that's what the study found. In fact, nobody's ever done, as the NIH, she mentions that it's been reanalyzed a couple of times. It was only reanalyzed once, and it was reanalyzed by the National Institutes of Health. They're the ones who went back and found out that there was more data that had not been included in the original paper that was published 16 years later. And, the fellow who wrote that paper, Christopher Maramsden, is now the head of the I think they call it the lipid peroxidation lab at the National Institutes of Health. He's the one who did the study of inflammatory migraines in humans, showing that reducing linoleic acid and increasing omega-3 fats was beneficial in that condition, showing a clear link between an inflammatory disease and omega-6 fats in humans. So, yeah,
Yeah.
give me a break.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I got about halfway through it, and then, it was just kind of nonsense.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you didn't waste too much time on it. I really appreciate that rebuttal to some of the things. It was also like the way she was saying things. You can kind of pick it up on like your bullshit meter when people are saying like seed oils apparently are so bad for you. And she'll make a claim without anything like backing it up. And so already it just seems like you're not really focusing on the right things. She's the study you're referencing, the Minnesota coronary trial, was a randomized control trial done very, very well. In fact, I'll link up a podcast episode done by Malcolm Gladwell where he talks about some of the data that they collected, how it was all hidden, how the son, Franz's son, I can't remember what his name was, had to drive to Rochester to dig out some of the data out of the basement of his father's home after it ended up at his place. This is like you said, a very well done study that didn't go the way they wanted it to, so they just buried the data. And she's on this podcast talking about how great epidemiological surveys are, like asking people what they ate for the last year and how good of data that is. It's just bullshit.
Well,
it's complete bullshit.
I mean, the FFQs, the study that I mentioned before, the EPIC study that found the relationship between linoleic acid and colitis, was an FFQ study. So by her, she and Zach have a discussion about FFQ, about food frequency questionnaires, and she's a big fan of them. So by her standards, that should be a good study. And it shows a dose-dependent relationship between dietary linoleic acid consumption and a common inflammatory disease in humans, right? So case closed. Linoleic acid causes inflammation. All right, let's move on. So, but apparently she's not aware of that study, or she just doesn't have the curiosity. But you know what? And this is what gets back to my Wall Street stuff. If you're going to go say there's no evidence for something, you bloody well better be sure, okay? You can say, I'm not aware of any evidence or whatever, but if you're going to say, when you look at the actual clinical evidence, there is actually no data, no credible data that seed oils are actually implicated in any chronic disease processes, you're lying. If you don't say, I'm not aware, you're lying, okay? And her own field of interest, the microbiome, we have good evidence that these things cause, both in humans and in animals, that these things cause inflammation, right? I mean, give me a break.
Yeah. Very interesting and a really good point. So she does say, which true, like you do need some in the diet. You get it from Whole Foods all over the place.
No, she's lying about that too.
Perfect.
She's lying. I mean, look, I that one I'll give her. Let's just say I'll give her that one. Okay, and here's why. In the 1930s, it was shown that linoleic acid is essential. It was thought to be shown that it was essential. Okay. If you remove all polyunsaturated fats from the diet, people or animals get very sick. Okay. So there are clearly essential fats. The research that was done to show that linoleic acid is not essential was only done within the last few years. Okay. By a group in Boston that was trying to demonstrate that a low linoleic acid therapy was okay in humans because it had the actually essential fats, DHA and arachidonic acid, right? But you know what? She's got a PhD. She claims to be an expert. I'll give her that one though. It was recent research. Not everybody's aware of it. I've talked to some guys I respect who weren't aware of that little piece of research that was done. I did interview Tom Brenna in episode 5 of my podcast, who is the gentleman who inspired that line of research. So, if you go look at that, we discuss it a little bit at the end. And basically what they did, and this is another funny thing about her whole, she goes on about mechanism and animal research and blah, 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 and how important it is to show this stuff in humans. Well, the data she cites for linoleic acid being essential was only shown in rodents, right? Nobody's ever done a RCT in humans trying to induce essential fatty acid deficiency. It was done by accident in the course of therapy, right? And what they discovered is that if you have too much linoleic acid in the course of this therapy called total parenteral nutrition, TPN, that it's super harmful for humans, right? And if you give them nothing but linoleic acid, humans will become omega-3 fatty acid deficient and get very sick, right? But again, make up your mind. Are these mechanisms dependent? Is an animal model okay? Well, according to her, it's okay when you're going to say linoleic acid is essential, right? But so what they did to finally disprove it, because again, this is research that's never going to be done in humans. You can't intentionally put humans on a diet that's going to cause harm, right? So finally what they did is they took mice, they put them on a diet that had long chain animal-based fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-3 DHA and omega-6 arachidonic acid, and they sustained this rodent population for 10 generations of mama having babies, babies having babies, on and on and on for 10 generations. And they were all perfectly normal without any linoleic acid for 10 generations. Wow. So it's clearly not essential. If I was going to bet in humans, I would say that it may well be essential at some tiny level, but it's such a low level that there has never been a case in history of a human becoming deficient in omega-6 fatty acids outside of a lab or a physician's care, right? Never happened. It's just impossible.
Okay,
so claiming that, oh, you need to eat lots of omega-6 fatty acids because it's essential is BS.
Okay, yeah. Well, I really appreciate that. I certainly wasn't convinced by her argument. I was curious that anybody would make the argument. It definitely didn't convince me. But I really appreciate the rebuttals and the way you kind of think about that and approach that. Is there anything else we want to talk about as far as the seed oils and inflammation goes before I ask you a few questions about wheat as well?
No, we'll probably get back into that so one of the other things she talks about is biomarkers, right? There are a couple of biomarker studies looking at linoleic acid, right? Which is technically, they're measuring it in plasma. There are lots of other biomarkers of linoleic acid consumption, right? Some of them directly cause inflammation, right? Why not look at those? I mean, honestly, the funny thing about linoleic acid is that they're right. It doesn't cause inflammation in the native form. It's only when it becomes oxidized that it causes inflammation. And I mean, you can find entire journal articles looking at oxidized linoleic acid metabolites and inflammation, right? Oxidized LDL. There's an enormous amount of papers in the cardiovascular literature looking at oxidized LDL, which is a linoleic acid metabolite, you know, in the body causing inflammation, right? That's the whole cardiovascular disease literature in the modern era is basically looking at oxidized linoleic acid metabolites causing disease and inflammation in humans.
Mm,
So yeah, saying, oh, look, this one study doesn't show it. Well, it's just cherry picking. It's ridiculous cherry picking.
yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, that brings up another question then. They kind of make the point that, like, as long as you're not heating up seed oils, and they almost make it seem like you have to heat them up over and over and over again to get those really oxidized kind of particles that they're talking about. That's not true, right? When we're getting seed oils in our diet, it is long oxidized. It has been oxidized way before we're even consuming it, buying it, and then potentially probably cooking it, especially if it's in the form of an oil. Is that correct?
Yeah, from what I've read, the level of oxidized linoleic acid in, excuse me, cooking oils is 400 to 1,000 times the level that you would expect to find in LDL. Okay, let's bring it back to the body. So, in the process of being produced, these oils are oxidized, right? And does it get further oxidized in the body? Absolutely, it does. You can find a whole raft of papers looking in humans at oxidized linoleic acid metabolites like 4-hydroxynonenal, like MDA, protein carbonyls. I mean, they're commonly used markers, biomarkers of inflammatory and oxidative stress in the body in humans, right? There's tons and hundreds of thousands of papers, literally, looking at these things, right? Claiming that there's no credible evidence. That's just baloney.
Wow. Wow. Okay. On that note, again, I had some questions about wheat that I wanted to ask you. You hear stories that our wheat has been greatly modified and transformed in the last 50 to say 100 years. We know that Europe has different rules about their wheat than we do here in America with our wheat. What you were saying earlier, I thought was really curious that when we started consuming wheat, we could look in the skeletons and already see that it was causing problems. So is
Yeah.
wheat itself in its normal original form as inflammatory as our current wheat? Is it just that we modified it so much today, or has this always been a problem and not really a safe food for humans?
So the original form of wheat is called einkorn. It's apparently still grown and consumed in um, the biblical lands, in the area around Israel. It supposedly does not contain the amino acid that was crossbred in when it was crossed with goat grass, right? All modern wheat has this amino acid, and it's actually, um, but it's not a recent problem, right? But one of the researchers who's done leading research on this, Alessio Fasano, he went back and he reanalyzed blood samples that were taken from soldiers at the end of World War II and then compared them to modern blood samples. And he found that the rate of celiac disease has gone up by about fourfold since then, right? The wheat hasn't changed. Something else in the diet has changed. Fasano's hypothesis is that it's something to do with um, bacterial inflammation in the gut that's making us more susceptible to, as I mentioned, a lot of autoimmune diseases can be triggered by a real infection. That's his hypothesis as to why celiac disease has gotten more common. Um, my hypothesis is that it's probably the intake of, or the increased intake of seed oils that's causing these inflammatory processes, and there may be some crossover. I've seen a little bit of evidence for that, but nothing really great. But that's my thought. So I'm not aware of anything that's happened in the last 50 years that would cause wheat to be that much different. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that was done in the 1950s and 60s during the Green Revolution, trying to make various different plant species to be more, to be more robust and more easily grown. They may have upped the level of this amino acid, like in dwarf wheat. I mean, it's interesting. Goat grass is Wheat is typically a fairly tall plant, right? Goat grass is a short plant. When you take dwarf wheat, which is dwarf winter wheat, which is most of the wheat that's grown in the earth nowadays, it's almost indistinguishable from goat grass. And cross-contamination of wheat with goat grass is a big problem because it's tough to tell the two plants and the seeds apart. So, but the original crossing of goat grass was done 10,000 years ago, right? And, we have lots of evidence of, celiac disease was discovered to be caused by wheat during World War II, long before any of the Green Revolution research was done, so it's an older problem. I looked into this a lot and I can't find anything that would point the finger at something dramatically novel happening to wheat in the last 50 years. Celiac disease was first described 1800 years ago.
Wow.
It's an old disease. It's an old human disease.
Okay.
So, I'm super gluten intolerant myself. I don't know exactly why. I, depending on what country I'm in, I would or would not be diagnosable as being celiac disease. There are different diagnostic standards. I do not have the genetic marker for celiac disease that I was talking about earlier. But I did have the tissue transglutaminase autoantibody when I was tested for it shortly after I quit eating wheat. And I have reactions to stuff that are supposed to be celiac safe, like whiskey. Damn it.
Damn it. Damn it.
So I can't drink whiskey, which is a bummer.
Uh, that sucks.
And beer is definitely out for me. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart because I was a big fan of microbrews and single malt scotches and all this stuff until I realized what it was doing to me. And I was hospitalized a bunch of times. Beer makes my stomach lining rupture and start bleeding. And,
Oh my goodness.
even a 6-pack of beer over a few days will do that and I'll start vomiting blood. So this is like a big deal for me.
Wow.
And I've done a lot of research into it, and I think, kind of I think anybody who has, my long and short of this is anybody who has any kind of autoimmune disease, allergies, asthma. Wheat's a known cause of, they call it baker's asthma, right? It's implicated in cold-induced asthma, which I also used to have. So basically what I tell anybody who has any sort of autoimmune disease is you should try going on a gluten-free diet. And you'll probably see some benefit because there's lots of cross associations between celiac and every single autoimmune disease I was able to look at. But, I don't, I, it's not the cause of all of our chronic diseases. That was what I was going down, and I just couldn't find any evidence for that. And then when I started, when I was finally able to start looking into the oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, that's when I started finding all the research, the connections to heart disease, the connections to, various different autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis and lupus and fibromyalgia. These are all tied into what they call oxidative stress. And the primary markers of oxidative stress in the literature are oxidized omega-6 fats.
Wow. Okay. Well, if somebody is taking in that information, they're on board, they want to cut out gluten, they want to cut out seed oils, they're going to very quickly make the realization that pretty much everything they're going to find in a normal grocery store contains probably both of those things, and along with a lot of other crap that we shouldn't have. So at the end of the day, what should we be focusing our nutrition around? What sorts of things should we be eating to really optimize our health and avoid some of these chronic conditions?
Well, I'll tell you what I told my wife, when we got together back in 2019, you want to avoid gluten. And again, as I just said, I don't think that's necessary for everybody, but if you have an autoimmune disease, absolutely. Avoid refined carbohydrates, avoid seed oils, and make sure you're getting sufficient animal protein and animal fats, right? And I think the latter two things is really, really important because there seem to be beneficial effects of certain animal fats that you cannot get from vegetable fats. There are odd chain saturated fats that seem to be beneficial. There are trans fats that are contained in animal fats, which, despite some ignoramus dietitian comments, including in the dietary guidelines, natural trans fats are perfectly healthy. They're thought to be health promoting. Your body actually has to convert all polyunsaturated fats into trans fats in order to metabolize them, right? So synthetic trans fats are a bad thing. Natural trans fats are not a bad thing. Don't be scared away by the dopes running the dietary guidelines when they say saturated and trans fats should be avoided. They're just trying to scare you away from animal fats, and there's no good evidence to support that. The evidence is the reverse, right? Dairy fat is associated with lower rates of obesity, lower rates of type 2 diabetes. It has no relationship or beneficial relationship with cardiovascular disease. And I think that just, dairy is an obvious type of animal fat. Duh. It should be obvious. But some people, I get it. They can't have, they don't react well to dairy. There's some interesting research thinking that that's a result of a problem caused by gluten. But, if you can't eat dairy, you can't eat dairy. But I would make sure that you're getting enough ruminant fats via eating ruminants so that you're getting the benefits of these natural fats.
Okay, perfect. That sets me up for kind of my last question. You personally, where are you at with your own current diet, and what health benefits do you now appreciate since you changed the way you've been eating?
Oh gosh, that may be a whole nother episode. I mean, I was such a mess when I fixed my diet. I had broken 6 bones in 2 years, so I was probably borderline osteopenic. I was having these, the autoimmune reactions that I talked about. I would burn in the sun in like 45 minutes. I, you know, it was just a mess. I was a mess, and everything got better. I mean, I had a doctor who I thought at the time was a good doctor, and I needed to see him all the time. So it was really positive that I had him, and I fired him because I just went from needing to see the doctor all the time to never needing to see the doctor. And that was in 2000, maybe 12 or 13 that I fired him.
Wow.
And, you know, my wife's a nurse. It was a really funny conversation when my wife and so when I told my wife that, right, when I gave her that advice, she's now my wife. At the time we had gone to high school together and then gone our separate ways and got back together in 2019 and discovered we were perfect for each other. So I gave her that piece of advice. She was a vegan at the time, right? She, and not just a vegan, she was a Michael Grieger vegan. She was an organic farmer. She made all of her own, or most of her own food in her own organic farm on her property up in upstate New York. And she was overweight. She had an autoimmune disease. So I gave her that advice. And, I don't like to argue with people. She's a friend. She asked me, what are you doing? Because we went out to dinner and I had to have this long negotiation with the waitress about what I could eat. And she's like, well, you look great. What do you do? What are you doing? What should I do? And I told her, and she called me up like 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, and she said, okay, I'm doing what you said, and I've lost 17 pounds so far in a
Wow.
few weeks.
Wow.
And she went on to lose 56 pounds in 3 months. And she put her autoimmune disease in remission. She had had fibromyalgia since her 20s, triggered by a very stressful event in her life. but she had been to see all the best, doctors in New York City, where she was living at the time. And she was probably about 30 years into an autoimmune disease, and it went into remission in a couple of months.
Wow.
And now it comes back when we go out, and, if we go out and eat out at restaurants for a couple of days in a row, there's enough seed oils to bring back her fibromyalgia. But other than that, she's great. So 30
Wow.
years of pain gone.
Amazing. Wow. And so what is a day of eating like for you now?
Oh, yeah. So what do I eat? Beef. I try and avoid concentrated sources of seed oils. The thing I'm really afraid of is gluten. I can't eat any gluten. I can't even get trace amounts of gluten. That doesn't hold for everybody. That's my particular case. So I don't eat any gluten at all. I eat other starches, safe starches, like rice or potatoes or whatever. I try and avoid concentrated sources of omega-6 fats, which obviously means seed oils or things made with seed oils, like most kinds of mayonnaise. I don't use a lot of olive oil in cooking. I avoid animals, industrially raised animals like chicken and pork for the most part. I mean, I'll eat some pork, hardly any chicken. Honest to God, if you don't eat any chicken, you're never going to miss it. And then I try to get ruminants, because they have very low levels of polyunsaturates and very low levels of omega-6 polyunsaturates. Pastured ones have more natural levels of omega-3s. Pastured dairy, right, which again has better levels of omega-3s. I try and get enough fish. It's a bit of a challenge with my wife. She didn't like fish. She's kind of coming around, and we're eating more fish. But I think it's important to get sufficient omega-3 fats. But that doesn't mean you need to be taking fish oil pills. It means avoid, the most important thing you can do to increase your omega-3 fats is to decrease your omega-6 fats, and they will come up naturally. There's some sort of cross contamination where too much omega-6 lowers even long chain omega-3 fats in the body. So you want to do that. And then, I eat a bit more sugar now than I used to. I went on a low sugar diet when I was in my teens because of my cavities. And my dental health continued to get worse until I dropped seed oils. And then, I have had exactly one cavity since I was 19 years old, after having a whole mouthful of them when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Thanks to the dentist, who told me, if you don't want any more cavities, stop eating sugar. Well, he was right about that. But,
Yeah.
I realized when I started learning more about diets that if you're eating a healthy diet, you could probably get away with a bit more sugar than I used to eat. And, I mean, for decades, I would go through reading all the labels in the supermarket. It was one of the reasons why fixing my diet was easy for me, because I was already reading all the labels, looking for added sugar and avoiding those foods. So I had to add a couple more things into what I was looking for, but it was pretty easy to cut it out. And, luckily, this has all gotten a lot easier now than when I started doing it. I mean, you can go to a Costco and eat paleo. They've got gluten-free versions of lots of different foods. Avoiding seed oils is a bit more challenging, but certainly not impossible. I mean, the whole dairy department, the beef department, the produce department is all great. There's lots of stuff to eat in the supermarket once you know what to look for.
Yeah, I hope that's encouraging for somebody who's thinking like, this is going to be way too restrictive. I can't really pull this off. Just remember, there's so many other really good options, like you just listed, that we can construct our diet around if you want to avoid some of these chronic diseases. This has been an enlightening
And
discussion.
I would be remiss if I didn't plug the CD app that my partner Brian Curley and his wife Ashley and I have started, which is a way to help people find foods in the supermarket that are low in seed oils. Because, it is nice to have some processed foods once in a while. I mean, I like potato chips, not often, but once in a while I have potato chips, and there are now some good alternatives for potato chips cooked in, you know, coconut oil. I've seen avocado oil. They're even starting to do stuff in beef tallow. So we put this app together to help people shop, because it can be pretty overwhelming when you go to not everybody's going to do what I do. I mean, I once went to a Whole Foods and spent my lunch hour going through the salad dressing aisle,
It's
reading every
ridiculous.
single ingredient level. I found a single salad dressing that was actually
Wow.
made with olive oil. One out of the whole
One.
wall.
Oh, wow. That's one more than I would have assumed you would find. So, way
Yeah.
to sniff that one out. I would even assume that you'd be able to find one. So this app is products in the store related to like the seed oils and different products.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what
Right.
Ashley put this together as a bunch of PDFs that turned out to be really popular. So we made it into an app. And, at the moment, the app's free. So it's in the Apple Store and the Google Play Store, wherever people find apps. And it's just lists of products by category. So if you have, you know, we're trying to make this easier because as you just said, it can be intimidating and it's a pain in the ass, frankly.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully that'll make it easier for folks.
Excellent. We'll link that in the notes. What's the name of the app one more time?
CD,
CD. I love it.
SEEDY.
Awesome. Okay, great. We'll link that in the notes, like I said. Tucker, thank you so very much for your time and all this research that you put into such an really interesting topic. Where do you want people to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Well, I started up. I started up a Substack. I'm moving some of my old blog posts over to that, so I will point people to Substack. I am on Twitter, X now. I'm very active there, and I've got a YouTube podcast or YouTube and podcast, so people can look there. Everything's under my name, Tucker Goodrich. So hopefully, it should be pretty simple to find.
Excellent. Like I said, we'll link all of that. Thank you again so very much for your time today to educate us all about inflammation and some of these chronic illnesses and the things we can do in our diet to help that. So great to check up with you and glad everything's going well for you. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to chat with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me back, Casey. It was great. Good to talk to you again.
Great to talk to you as well. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.